You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hi, my name is Jayme Lemke. I'm a senior fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And I'm back here today for the next episode in our Liberalism for All series. My guest for this third installment, I think it'll be the third installment, is Mikayla Novak. Mikayla has a doctorate in economics from the Royal Institute of Technology in Melbourne, Australia, and she's currently working on a second PhD in sociology at the Australian National University in Canberra. She has two incredible books out already that I highly recommend if you haven't encountered them yet and had a chance to read them yet. Her 2018 book, Inequality, An Entangled Political Economy Perspective, which we'll be talking about on today's podcast. And then just last year, a new book titled Freedom and Contention, Social Movements and Liberal Political Economy, where Mikayla applies her sociologically intelligent liberal political economy approach to the study of social movements. And in that book, she includes historical and contemporary cases of social movements. She looks at the quest for the freedom to self-govern in the American Revolution. She talks about civil rights, women's rights, equal treatment for the LGBTQ community. So it's a fascinating blend of historical and contemporary cases that she takes this liberal political economy approach to. In this discussion today, Mikayla talks about liberalism as being a broad bucket. She highlights the deep historical roots of liberalism, which exists in different forms around the world. And in this argument for liberalism being a broad bucket, she includes a variety of ideological positions that include some version of commitment to open markets, open societies, freedom of association, and inclusive democratic political institutions. We also get into the difficult territory of the fact that as inspiring as that liberal vision is, liberal institutions also ask a lot of us. They require us to not just get along with, but actively negotiate with people who have different views and aspirations than we do, sometimes radically different. And that can be really hard. So Mikayla gives us her answer to the question of whether liberal orders are possible and whether they're capable of sustaining bubbles of illiberalism for those who hold fundamentally illiberal views. She talks about freedom of association as a core operating principle of liberal societies and how the work of James Buchanan and Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom can help us think about freedom of association in a democratic society. There are certainly tensions in those bodies of work that we don't have full time to get into in this podcast. So I do hope you'll check out the next Hayek Program Podcast episode after this, where I talk with John Metacraft in more detail about Buchanan's work and the Constitutional Political Economy Program as a political economy for equals. Mikayla and I in this episode also talk about the idea of good inequality and bad inequality, which is the idea that some forms of difference are to be celebrated in the sense that we can all bring our gifts and talents to the table. And this is what enables us to cooperate to mutual benefit in both economic and political spaces. But there are bad inequalities as well. And the liberal project is just as much about critiquing and correcting oppression, discrimination, and othering as it is about celebrating those productive forms of difference. Mikayla identifies some of the main drivers of inequality in law in recent history. And we wind the podcast with a little optimistic note with some opportunities to continue to move forward towards a free and open society for all. Now, there is at least one error in the conversation because I claim I was working on my PhD when Mikayla wrote her first book, which just goes to show that I've apparently not come to terms with my age because I finished my PhD well before she was writing. Fortunately, there's plenty of room for error and learning. in these long run conversations like this centuries long dialogue about liberalism that we're trying to have a little part in today. So I'll just chalk it up to a learning experience. And I definitely learned a lot in this conversation, so I won't prevent you from listening to it any longer. Without further delay, Dr. Mikayla Novak. Well, welcome, Mikayla. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Jayme. It's a pleasure to talk to you as always.
As you know, we're doing this kind of mini series for the Hayek program on the question of liberalism for all, with the idea behind that, trying to explore some of these thorny issues about the relationship between liberalism and equality. And what does it mean to live in a society where liberal values kind of apply for everybody and everybody gets to have that experience of living in a free, open society and what the world looks like there. And so, of course, naturally, with your work on inequality and on social change, I thought of you right away as someone that we absolutely had to have on this podcast. And so just to give some foundation here, because we've had a couple conversations already, but they've been more focused on specific issue areas. So I thought it would be kind of nice to start at the beginning and just ask you, in your studies, with your background, with your approach, what does liberalism mean in your mind, in your view?
So thank you for the opportunity, Jayme. It's a great pleasure to be here. Before I sort of arrive at, at an approximation to a working definition of what liberalism means, at least for me, I'd say a couple of things about liberalism. So the first thing I'd say about it is that it's an ideological, moral, and philosophical ecology of thought with actually an astoundingly diverse array of scholars, commentators, and even activists involved in its development. So you can think in this sense, anyone from anarcho-capitalists to small state minarchists, even through to welfarist liberals, could probably find themselves quite appropriately sitting within the liberal camp, so to speak. Another statement I'd just make about liberalism is that as a body of thought, it possesses actually a very long-run architecture. It developed in Europe, especially during the 17th and 18th century in its modern form. It extended out, as we all know, to the United States and other initially British colonial outposts around the world. In saying this, it should very much be appreciated that the core tenet of liberalism, at least, centered upon the fundamental dignity of the individual and the value of freedom, liberty, and individual rights can be detected and discerned in non-Western cultures. So we actually see liberal thinking very clearly evident in East Asia, the Middle East, Africa, elsewhere. So this points to a universalist tendency of liberalism as a body of thought. Okay, so despite all of the internal differences and the variegated historical background, I would argue actually there is a reasonable degree of coherence that is identifiable with liberalism, and it's reflected in a series of commitments. So the first one, and probably for, a modern sort of reader, would be, the first one would be market-based economic arrangements, and they're exemplified by competition, entrepreneurship, and innovation. The second key commitment, as I see it, of liberalism is of a civil society exhibiting openness, a key theme that you want to raise during this podcast. And this openness is revealed through freedom of association and the institutions of free inquiry and expression. The third plank of commitment for liberalism is a democratic political order characterised by limited government in accordance with the rule of law. So for me personally, there are actually two key factors which drew me to liberalism, and so which lead me to proudly self-label myself as a classical liberal. So the first issue is that liberal economic thought provided for me a credible explanation for the failure of Soviet-style central planning that I witnessed actually crumble and disintegrate during my late teens. So this phenomenon deserved explanation, and liberalism provided at the time, and still does in my view, the most credible explanation as to what occurred. And the second factor is that I largely view change within human societies as being beneficial and valuable, not only for individuals implicated in change, but for the broader society that is affected by change. Hayek, in his Constitution of Liberty, his famous 1960 tract, for example, did speak, especially in his epilogue, about a liberal not being fearful of change. And this is a normative, value-based commitment that I share. So for me, liberalism is the only vital philosophy in existence that I see offering a set of narratives that embraces change and doesn't convey fear and antipathy toward it, or even similar manifestations such as difference between individuals. Certainly insofar as change and difference is the byproduct of mutually agreeable interactions between persons. So this is what liberalism means for me.
First of all, I really appreciate that you pointed out that liberalism is something that we see in different cultures and different belief systems around the world, because I think there is a misconception sometimes that it's a purely Western philosophy, as opposed to autonomy and openness actually being ingredients in a variety of other belief systems.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And the sort of the academic characterization of neoliberalism, for example, sort of tends to equate modern instantiations of liberalism with some sort of Western cultural, political style of arrangements. Whereas I think one of the many criticisms that can be made of this caricature of neoliberalism is that, in fact, the thirst and the desire for freedom can be found everywhere around the world by literally everyone. So I think what you say is actually quite critical.
Yeah. And this idea of a thirst for freedom being something that's universal, I'm very sympathetic to that. Like it sounds very good to me. That's something that I feel in myself. It's something that I want to be true for the world. But at the same time, as we have this thirst for freedom, we also see, you brought up the Soviet experiment. We also see great willingness to oppress and sometimes even to put up with oppression. Mm-hmm. So, how is it that we reconcile that human impulse for freedom with that observed experience that we see around the world? Or maybe another way to put it is that change is often something that brings us great possibility and hope and life, but it's also often something that we very much fear and try to control and try to change. So there's always this kind of countervailing pressure to want to be free, but also to want to control. And you kind of can't have both simultaneously.
Look, I think there is a core principle within liberalism being of freedom of association, and properly understood. And I think this is the key thing. What's the proper understanding of freedom of association? It gives rise to many sort of forms of communal sort of interactivity that many of us cherish, such as family, neighborhood, a sense of community. there is always a sort of a risk of these kinds of very laudable values being misappropriated, particularly in the service of political ends. So, so for example, we have the sort of potential for sort of policies to be used that basically enforce associations that might otherwise be sort of more fluid, perhaps even more unstable if they were actually sincerely and genuinely the product of sort of individual choices. So individuals can sort of enter free associations and exit from associations that they find to be unsatisfactory. So there's always a sort of great risk that from a liberal perspective that sort of politics may sort of manifest a forced mechanism for association and exchange that people might not otherwise want. And in the limit, and as you referred to, we find the horrors of the 20th, and my concern is that some of those horrors of the 20th century, specifically autocracy, if not totalitarianism, is probably starting to sort of creep back in to our sort of political arrangements. And that's very closely associated with intolerance of difference and the freedom of people to actually, select their own forms of associations that suit them. One must recognise, the limits of our knowledge and sort of avoid sort of the hubris of actually knowing other people's, the people that we don't know about, their preferences for association. There's a risk politically to presume that everyone uniformly sort of shares the same sort of preferences and tastes, the same kinds of associations, the same kinds of living. So I think a genuine, sincere classical liberalism is one that certainly certainly endorses a minimalist rules of the game so that we can all cooperate effectively, but doesn't really go beyond that to try to prescribe or proscribe certain modes of living. These are sort of debates which are sort of creeping back into political discourse now, and I think liberalism provides something very attractive to offer as a contribution to these debates.
Yeah, I think you're right that we do tend to imagine that people have these preferences and these views that are very similar to ours, and that they feel the same way about toleration, or that they have similar reactions. And this is actually, Tocqueville made a similar observation when he was touring the United States in the early 19th century. And he wrote about one of the potential dangers of an egalitarian democratic society is that it's wonderful that we all see ourselves as equals, but then it becomes easier to do just what you were saying and imagine. So if I'm equal to them, they must think the same way I do. They must feel the same way I do and want the same things that I do. So which, at least for me, then that immediately sends me to thinking about democratic theory. And if we're not all the same, if we are all different, what are the circumstances under which we're able to come together and negotiate around that and actually come to some kind of mutual agreement and have these peaceable arrangements, even if we aren't necessarily all on the same page about everything. And I know you've written about democracy before as well. And in your book on inequality, which we'll talk about it in more detail kind of shortly here, you cite James Buchanan, the public choice and constitutional political economist, as one of the big influences for that. This is such a broad topic, so I'm not sure exactly how I want to phrase this question. but if your comment and Tocqueville's observation are right, and there's kind of this tension that exists within a democratic society, rather, between liberalism and equality, how do we start thinking about being kind of liberal and democratic at the same time?
Look, I'm firmly of the view that liberalism is ardently a democratic theory, certainly as well, and so one must sort of grapple and wrestle with the kind of question that you've raised. And I think for me, I think there is a way to sort of work around or to sort of negotiate these tensions quite productively, or at least conceptually, and that is to sort of to appreciate that a democratic structure may embrace a sort of general sort of governance system that we refer to, or at least Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom referred to as polycentricity. And so what we find here is a democratic arrangement that actually respects differences and actually respects the reality of divergent tastes and preferences, not only with respect to the provision of essential public goods, but in terms of preferred modes of living, and that it's actually quite legitimate for those differences to actually be realised through a political process. Otherwise, we don't have a democracy, do we? So the Ostromian orientation here is to recognise not only the existence, but more importantly, the desirability, the normative desirability of multiple centres of power in which people can come together and, collectively bargain over that array of sort of public goods and services and regulations that they prefer. This arrangement allows for a sufficient degree of voice, and voice is not restricted to limited sort of ballot initiatives that take place, every 3, 4, 5 years. But the voice incorporates what Frank Knight and James Buchanan himself referred to as government by discussion. So there is constant dynamic conversation that occurs on a frequent basis as people reveal information about their sort of opinions, and people by this sort of byplay of talk, people actually discover and learn about what is the content of public opinion and how that changes over time. So you have the importance of voice mechanisms, which I think are certainly going to be enshrined in a democracy, certainly not in a totalitarian situation where a ruler would basically tend to tell subjects not to speak, and certainly not to speak in ways that are divergent from the party line, so to speak. And complementing the voice mechanism, and I'm going to Hirschman, and there's complementarities between Hirschman and Ostrom. We have the important role played by exit mechanisms as well. And so we have a polycentric democratic order. And this is an inherently liberal order, I would argue. You would actually also have a mechanism by which if the discourse gets to a standstill, or for some subgroups within a population, minority groups, for example, if it's found that the content of voice and discourse is not translating into preferred public policies in a given jurisdiction, in a given centre of political power, then those individuals have a right to move to another jurisdiction that's more amenable to their preferences. So I think the polycentric sort of model sort of encompasses this. I'd also sort of just add in to this sort of system of thinking, probably a really rather underappreciated strand of thinking offered by Robert Nozick, who refers to the desirability of multiple competing utopias and a minimal state framework which overlays the existence of these multiple utopias. So, this might well correspond in actually existing societies to competitive federal systems. America is some sort of rough approximation to that kind of arrangement where you basically have a given level of government, let's say presumably a higher level of government, that tries to maintain a minimal framework of public governance by which our equal liberties can be exercised, that is protecting our property rights, our contractual freedoms, then other sort of basic parts of a liberal order, such as monetary stability, freedom to trade and whatnot. But underneath that sort of overlaying minimal state are these, competing multiple jurisdictions that provide different forms of preferred states of the world for different citizens, so different competing utopias. So I think there is a way in which liberalism can provide a model by which the apparent tensions of unity and diversity may be reconciled, at least in some sort of robust and functional manner. We can't rule out, of course, there are obviously going to be tensions. We can't assume that, people are going to find themselves in unanimous agreement all the time about every matter under the sun. We can't presume that. There is going to be, as part of a system of sort of government by discussion, we're going to actually find some conflicts on the margins. But hopefully the liberal model provides a sort of framework of a polycentric liberal democratic order, which might help us get around some of these tensions. In actually existing societies, we have a problem where policies and regulations are increasingly monocentric in character. That is to say that the possibility of competition between political jurisdictions is being diminished, with many of the great policy issues being decided at one level of government. The stakes are too high under that kind of arrangement. And so under a polycentric system, we have, I believe, a very great prospect of reducing the stakes of monocentric politics, most certainly.
Yeah, it all comes back to what you said at the beginning about freedom of association. And freedom of association, you could almost think of it as a primary principle within liberalism, out of which a lot of the other implications, or you highlighted these three core areas that are associated with liberal value systems: market entrepreneurship, openness to civil society, limited government. In a way, these are all different versions of saying freedom of association. Can you associate freely in business and within your communities? Are you not overly limited in that by your government? And I've done some work on polycentricity as well. So I see the merits of, under the right polycentric system, there being the potential for a set of democratic rules under which we interact with each other in a way that is primarily directed by freedom of association, but yet still has the orderly features of a safe society that we like. And we do still have the possibility of being able to do collective projects together and having, mutually agreed upon public activities that don't infringe on individual rights. So I see the beauty of that possible framework. Okay, and now I'm coming to a question. I see the beauty of that framework, but I also see how it's going to work in a liberal direction a lot more effectively if people are fundamentally liberal. But what if people do not have views that are fundamentally liberal? And maybe we don't need to try to resolve this right now. Maybe I'm asking the kind of the unanswerable question. But if people are willing to kind of sacrifice that freedom in order to get some kind of control over others, or if it is some other value that they're prioritizing. This is a conversation that I've had with colleagues in the past with respect to police reform. So, I think, those of us who are concerned about that issue, it's so obvious that it's a broken system that needs to be fixed within the United States and within many other countries around the world. But what if your average voter or even a plurality of voters is happy to put up with a little police abuse because they believe it's going to make them safer at the end of the day? Then you can imagine freedom of association not working out so well for groups that are particularly targeted by the police, not working out all that well for people who get involved in activities that are criminalized, perhaps inappropriately criminalized. What if the people don't hold liberal values? Will those democratic checks? I don't know. Do you want to answer that, or we can move on to inequality?
No, look, I think what you raise is actually really important, and oftentimes when I sort of hear these sort of questions, I often sort of cast my mind to that body of scholarship that asks the following rhetorical question: can liberalism accommodate, for example, socialism? In some circumstances, specific circumstances, probably say the answer is yes, but as a sort of a contingent yes. And what I mean by that, and going back to this idea of sort of multiple jurisdictions or sort of multiple utopias which allow for the revelation of different experiments of living. It's quite possible, for example, for a group of like-minded people to coalesce, let's say in a small geographic area. Oh, even think about, for example, socialist communes. There've been many thousands of socialist communes that have been established, throughout the West over the centuries. Under a sort of polycentric liberal order, it's quite possible for people to freely associate in a manner in which they sort of commit to a shared value of socialism at a small scale. But the issue there is that people under a sort of a broader liberal arrangement, a sort of meta utopia, are basically free still to exit such communities. So an implication there is that these small-scale socialist communities that are situated within a broader liberal order, probably not self-sustaining, because people will soon discover or relearn the basic insight that a non-socialist order found elsewhere in society that provides an abundance of goods that most effectively meets human capabilities, that sort of provides the most robust improvements in well-being. Well, these will be found to be much preferred to these sort of small-scale socialist communities. So I think the answer is a contingent yes in that kind of example, for as long as there's freedom of exit, which is in quintessentially a part of freedom of association.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, I'll just turn to this briefly, if I may. You turn to the example of policing. And so now we're sort of dealing with a quite different set of issues in that we are thinking about the provision of public services that are used in an arbitrary manner, which are actually used to enforce discrimination and stratification. Different groups of people are being mistreated by the police, and this is a hot button issue in the US and elsewhere around the world. There is a key liberal principle of non-discrimination and relational equality, and these two are inevitably tied at the hip. And what this insists is that there is an equality of treatment, fundamental dignity and respect, including with respect to the provision of public services. After all, taxpayers pay, are conscripted to pay for these public services such as policing. And so it is a fundamental condition of liberal public governance that these services are provided without fear or favour across all of the population that have actually paid for the services. So there are some different issues necessarily that I've thrown in there, but certainly what I'm saying is not the final answer to the very interesting questions which continue to energize the minds of liberals, but they would be my sort of initial sort of responses. So thinking about freedom of exit, but if there's no freedom of exit, then thinking about a non-discrimination principle, right, as a core part of the liberal order, including public governance.
Yeah, you gave me a little bit of reason for hope, Mikayla, so thank you for that. But yeah, I think that freedom of exit is critically important. That's something that I've emphasized a lot in conversations about women's economic rights, because when people are denied the ability to earn and provide for themselves, that is a form of a restriction on exit from a country, but also maybe even just from your family or the community that you live in. So I think, if we do recognize the importance of that freedom of exit, a natural next thought for me is, okay, so how can we, exit is never going to be costless. We all, it's one of the first things that comes up in any conversation about this, is that it's very difficult for people to make big changes in their lives. And of course that's true, but what can we do as a society to facilitate that freedom of exit and kind of give these institutions these democratic institutions their best chance for actually serving people and kind of and staying constrained. But I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk about this issue of inequality and the wonderful book that you wrote about it.
Thank you.
And I'm so impressed by your scholarship, and for me, it kind of, you were writing this when I was working on my PhD at George Mason, and it almost came out of nowhere for me. There's somebody, Richard Wagner was just had recently written this stuff on entangled political economy, and all of a sudden there's somebody from Australia who's written a whole book about it. I thought everybody that was working on this was somebody I knew through economics and through my program. So it was just a really exciting discovery for me to find your book. But I think the first question I want to ask you, and then we can talk about kind of some of the core arguments. One of the observations you make in the introduction to this book is that many people who consider themselves liberal find it difficult to see inequality as something that's problematic. And you don't speculate in the book as to why. If I had to speculate, and maybe I shouldn't, but I will anyway. Maybe it's because it's not that they don't see the problem, but they just think it's low priority relative to issues like economic growth. I think sometimes there's some reluctance to dig into the conversation about inequality because of how often historically movements that use the rhetoric of equality have been oppressive or resulted in the creation of, large public apparatuses that many in the liberal camp would view as unnecessarily restrictive or, holding back economic growth, holding back freedom of association. The world has changed a lot since you wrote that book, though. So I just want to, the world as a whole, we've kind of been through a lot the past few years. So I guess I just want to ask you to share some of your thoughts on that experience of, writing a book at the time as an economist. Now you're an economist and a sociologist, but at the time, primarily an economist, writing that book about, in a conversation that maybe some people didn't want to have. And how has the nature of that conversation changed in the last few years?
So thank you very much for the very kind words. And I just want to sort of reinforce the basic notion that classical liberals are found scattered in pockets around the world. And so for me, it's very gratifying to know that that my work sort of has been sort of received positively. So writing the book, which was my first book, was a really enjoyable and enriching experience, I have to say. And perhaps the most difficult part of writing the book was in the conceptual and thematic planning, given that, inequality is, a major field of research effort and inquiry in its own right. But once I arrived at an estimation of the potential to explore the topic of inequality using Richard Wagner's entangled political economy framework, the remaining challenge was to actually keep the work within initially agreed word length bounds. There's just so much abundant opportunity to actually apply that EPE framework to this question. So in terms of my, I guess my own sort of scholarly sort of repertoire, I felt I was very much prepared to write the book because I had enjoyed sort of roughly about 20 years of prior experience to academia, both within sort of professional circles, including within an Australian think tank. And this allowed me to encounter firsthand debates and policy arguments with respect to questions of income distribution. So that helped. And so another sort of issue which made me feel that I had a strong scholarly base to write this effort was that my own experiences. So I was an undergraduate at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia in the early 1990s, and I was probably the only sort of classical liberal in my economics class. So, Berlin Wall fell, that demanded explanation. So I went around, pottering around in the university's library, trying to sort of find out, what's a credible explanation for things that I'm seeing, right? These amazing epochal events. And so I stumbled upon the likes of the Cato Journal, Dick Wagner's works, other sort of research outputs produced by GMU scholars at the time. Yes, they're all contained even in a faraway place as Brisbane, Australia. And so, since that time, the early 1990s, I've been providing myself every opportunity, to really delve quite deeply into Austrian Bloomington and Virginia schools of political economy. How have things changed over the past few years? I actually do think that there has been some productive engagement by classical liberals toward matters of inequality. So in this respect, I'll probably briefly refer to the work of the late great American classical liberal Steve Horwitz, who together with one of your amazing colleagues, an incredible economist, Vincent Geloso, have illuminated the distinctions between so-called good and bad determinants of inequality. This is actually sort of a key apparatus for my book. So certain entanglements which give rise to material inequalities, some of those are morally unexceptional. So, for example, if people exercise their entrepreneurial talent or invest in their human capital and, sell their talents, sell their wares, sell their goods and services to other people on a voluntary, mutually agreeable basis, that gives rise potentially to inequality. People are different after all. This is why we trade. And so inequalities will arise, but those inequalities are not morally dubious or exceptional. On the other hand, there are a range of inequalities. As a liberal, one can largely identify with regressive government policies that promote upward redistribution, that encourage rent-seeking processes through legal, regulatory, and fiscal policies. These drive inequalities in a way that limit growth and opportunity. And this distinction between good and bad sources of inequality is something that Geloso and Horwitz had raised since the time of writing my book, but certainly sort of fit in with the broad apparatus, the framework that I've explicated. And I'd also raise, once again, Vince's work more recently with Phil Magnus, an amazing paper now published in the Economic Journal that I would encourage everyone to read, that actually recalibrates Thomas Piketty's data set with respect to measures of income inequality. So what Geloso and Magnus find is that the degree of income inequality in the US, and I'm guessing I suspect it might be the case in other countries too, given the problems of the quality of taxation data, income records and taxation data. They find that inequality is overstated within Piketty's data set. So there is a growing reception, right, to this issue, even if there has been some sort of normative suspicion about sort of inequality being misappropriated or used as a tool to justify greater government involvement in the economy. There is actually a liberal pathway to appreciating equality. After all, one of the great luminaries of liberalism, Adam Smith, included equality as part of his statement of a liberal plan that included also freedom and justice. Equality stands as a tripod. And so I think liberals should actually be concerned about inequality in order to convey to policymakers and the public two or three things. The first thing is that there needs to be a better understanding of inequality on the market as informed by a process of economic interaction by mutually agreeable individuals that is largely morally unexceptionable. The second point I'd suggest as to why inequality should be of interest to classical liberals is that there is a malign effect of fiscal, legal, and regulatory policies in aggravating inequality owing to the effects of policy on suppressing pro-equality or equalising market competition and entrenching special interest privileges. And something else I'll just add in, to actually remind liberals of the place of equality within, as I said, the liberal philosophical triadic scheme of freedom, justice, and equality, with equality properly understood as an equality in basic human dignity, mutual respect, and treatment in accordance with the rule of law.
Yeah. So this reminds me of another debate that has a similar structure. So if you're having a conversation about, is acquiring wealth good? There are two very simple answers to that question that I think are both wrong. So one is to say, yes, definitely good. Always good. Well, but what if you are using violence to acquire wealth? What if you are stealing to acquire wealth? We can't just say greed is good, because in the wrong circumstance, greed can use all kinds of nefarious tools to get what it wants. So if we focus on those and then say no, so acquiring wealth is bad, then we miss out on all of those productive exchanges and the benefits of those. So correct me where I'm wrong or missing nuance, but it sounds like the big picture you're trying to share here is that the answer to the question of, is inequality problematic? Similarly, that also cannot be a simple yes or a simple no. It has to be it depends. It depends on what's driving that inequality.
Correct. So this brings right to the fore a contemporary classical liberal appreciation of institutional equality. So whether inequality is problematic or not is contingent upon the nature and the shape and the quality of institutions. Institutions that are inclusive, institutions that empower individuals to exercise their entrepreneurial talents, their human capital, their distributed and dispersed unique knowledge in competition, in fair competition with other people, may induce as a byproduct inequalities in an income distribution, again, which are not morally exceptionable. So the key here is that under this situation, the game is being ordered by rules that allow basically for a free-flowing interplay between individuals with no artificial sort of or particularized restraints or even advantages as provided by a regulatory or fiscal system. You start having problems in terms of inequality becoming a sort of genuinely social problem when inequalities are manifest under an institutional structure in which people are incentivized to seek particular advantages for themselves at the expense of everyone else through the aegis of government policy and legal favoritism. I think one of the most wonderful contributions to modern liberalism is the book written by James Buchanan and Roger Congleton in the late 1990s, Politics by Principle, Not Interest, in which they put in highlights the generality criterion as a criterion for being able to sort of tease out these varying effects. So if you have a political system in which generality and observance of the rule of law, non-discrimination, equal treatment of all under the law, to the extent that these are observed, then inequalities which occur under those sort of the umbrella of such arrangements of generality would be largely seen as unexceptional and in fact are a byproduct of a sort of dynamic economy and society in which betterment, the quest for betterment is respected and the fruits of betterment are widely shared.
That's fantastic. So when we do have these rules that allow people to take advantage of others in this way that generates inequality. Well, let me rephrase that. I don't want to ask when we do have them. I want to ask, what do they look like? And this kind of relates back to the question of how concerned should we be as, if you're a person who has liberal values, how concerned should you be about it? What does this look like? How big of a problem is it? What are some of the, can you give us any examples of some of the ways these rules are built into our legal systems, our political systems. You have a chapter in the book on tax policy and other regulations. So, I think some of these drivers of inequality, like you mentioned, there's more focus on this issue in the past few years. So more of them are starting to come to light. But I think there's still a lot to uncover. So can you uncover maybe just a little bit of it for us?
Sure. So I would say that political action certainly has been prevalent in all societies from antiquity. And so it stands to reason that political actors and the organisations they create and maintain, including government itself, naturally, are actually deeply implicated in economic inequalities. And this is particularly the case if choice and effort are winnowed through and influenced by politics rather than markets or any other realm of civil society, which is centred upon dyadic and voluntary exchanges. What does inequality look like? Well, we can look regrettably, even until recent history, to see what inequality looks like. Governments have tended to intertwine fiscal, regulatory and legal policies in a manner that have the effect of entrenching discrimination between groups of people on the basis of gender, race, and other criteria. I'm very well aware of your own important scholarship that refers to the effect of government policies, the restrictiveness of property rights that prevented women from being able to exercise upward economic mobility. That's one very important example. Another example, a primary and odious example of what inequality looks like, was the racially discriminatory legal systems in the American South, collectively known as the Jim Crow laws, which had largely persisted until the 1960s, which segregated on the basis of race the ability of individuals to access private accommodation and services and even to vote. If we sort of think about, there are actually lots of contemporary sort of examples of discriminatory legal treatment still sort of baked into our political systems. And one sort of reform I would always advocate to try to address these is, in as much as liberal reformists wish to conduct, for example, the likes of expenditure or fiscal audits of the state, liberals should actually consider generality audits, right? In the spirit of what Buchanan and Congleton talk about. So to thoroughly examine the way in which so not only the legal system, but regulatory and fiscal systems sort of maintain situations in which people are treated in a discriminatory manner. The whole range of small and large examples I can think of. So you can think of sort of same-sex partners, for example, in certain jurisdictions in the US and other parts of the world not being able to adopt, right, on a sort of the same basis as heterosexual sort of partners. One can think about a sort of even larger example of sort of immigration and immigration restrictions, which have the effect of aggravating global inequalities, because after all, if migrants are free to move and to be able to send remittances back home, that has a powerful effect of reducing global inequalities, which is a very laudable exercise in my view. And there's also another example that has been somewhat under the radar, but has been gathering growing attention amongst liberal scholars. I refer to, in this context, the work of Roger Koppel in particular, who has been raising concerns about legal and policy discriminations made on the basis of technocratic expertise. there was actually a really important opinion piece published a day or two ago in the Wall Street Journal by Roger and Abby Devereaux, referring to a new US federal agency, which is, supposedly has the sort of the divine sort of power to be able to sort of separate what is information versus disinformation, however conceived. So you sort of have you sort of have this sort of growth, and coincident with the emergence of so-called independent regulatory agencies, sort of a development of technocratic expertise, which basically sort of confounds democratic political processes, because after all, it is actually the legislators who are accountable to the electors, and the agencies are meant to be accountable to the legislators. Even another example of that, just very briefly, there are proposals in the Australian context amongst some sort of climate change policy advocates to instigate a new climate commission, in which the climate commission gives policy directives, the government somehow enforced to follow the directives of this independent commission, but also give detailed responses as to why the government will want to sort of depart from the technocratic advice provided by the climate commission. So that sort of flips democratic accountabilities upside down in a way that actually entrenches inequalities that are seen as risky and dangerous by classical liberals, apart from the equal treatment of equals and the fundamental rights of citizen voters to decide for themselves the political arrangements and policies under which they prefer to live.
Yeah, and those discriminatory policies actually translate then to differences in experience in the world. And I think, we recognize that so obviously when it comes to some policy areas, but I do feel like we have sometimes blind spots if the policy is only affecting a subset of the population in that way. Another example, maybe just to add one to your excellent list that I've been fascinated with lately, is there's an excellent book by Caroline Criado Perez called Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And so particularly with respect to your point about technocracy, when we start to make political decisions through technocratic means, now we're not just dealing with political biases, we're also dealing with scientific biases and measurement biases that are going to be informing what those, quote unquote experts imagine to be right. And so in this book, she just goes through an incredible accounting of the ways in which, the scientific process has not really studied women in the same way it's studied male bodies.
Yes, I know of this work, and it is an important contribution. I think that's an excellent addition that you make to our little list.
Yeah, this is, I think entangled political economy is the right framework for this, because it really is these connections that need to be teased out between the way we practice politics and the impact that then that winds up having on our ability to bring back in a phrase you started with at the beginning, how those politics affect our ability to relate to each other as dignified equals in this open space. Mm-hmm. So we're getting short on time here. So I want to kind of bring some of this together by asking you a final question. We only barely got to scratch the surface of all the excellent work that you've done. So maybe we'll be able to talk again, but certainly in the meantime, everybody should be reading your books, Inequality, and also Freedom and Contention, your more recent book on social movements. But with the study and the thought that you've put into this issue of equality in a free society, what are some of the opportunities that you see I don't know, a lot of my questions have maybe had a more pessimistic tone. So I want to put an optimistic tone on this one and ask, what are some of the opportunities you see going forward to help move us towards that vision? What can we do? I think it's very, very easy sometimes to feel disempowered as an individual who is kind of living in a world being battered around by this giant machine of politics and the major institutions of our world. But, so what can we actually do as people to kind of move forwards towards this vision of liberal equality?
So, although there seem to be many academics and certainly commentators who are willing to announce the end of liberalism before time, an appreciation of liberalism as a dynamic system of thought in the service of discovering how to live better and freer together suggests to me that there are actually numerous opportunities going forward to achieve the liberal principles of liberty, justice, and equality. And I'm actually quite hopeful, even in these sort of vexing and most troubling times. So to some extent, liberalism does enjoy periodic resurgences of interest, if not popularity, as a result of circumstance. So, and I think that not politicians, but actually populations will actually eventually tire of rampant price inflation, low economic growth, and all the biases and unfairness that is emanating from regulatory and budgetary capture by special interests, and all in their own different ways suppress economic and social opportunities. So a political liberalism that grasps the mettle of illustrating how, for example, supply-side reforms can transform limited life opportunities into abundant opportunities for all. I think that will enjoy certainly temporal flashes of electoral support, not only in the US, but elsewhere. But the sustainability of such outcomes will very much depend on the consistency and integrity of political alliances that liberal adherents forge, and also the quality of our arguments as well. So that said, I don't think liberalism is necessarily reducible to action in the political realm. And liberalism, as I've mentioned, is a set of ideological and philosophical dispositions concerning how to live good, flourishing lives. I suspect that a liberal praxis, will become more prominent over coming years and decades as liberal adherents increasingly engage with a range of prefigurative, experimentalist activities that not only seek to escape oppressive situations to exit, but actually explore what it actually means to be free in the 21st century. So what particular institutional and governance configurations I have in mind and that will emerge in the future, we can't entirely predict it with great precision, given the unknowability of cultural and social, technological change and so on. But there are certain sort of hints at this kind of liberal praxis coming to the fore. So if we take examples like blockchain or charter cities or free economic zones and other contemporary experiments as a guide to what the future might lie ahead. And I also anticipate that a liberal praxis will, to some extent, turn away from some of the insider politics, the formal politics that I've briefly mentioned, and probably towards a more outsider social movement repertoire, such as protests, as key means of expressing political grievances and demands. And finally, I actually think that certainly when it seems to me that the forces of social illiberalism are on the march, I think a so-called thick movement libertarianism is also going to be really important. Liberals will find themselves alliancing with a range of other figures and activists, for example, even the moderate left, for example, to challenge bigotry that works to facilitate exclusion and network closures that aggravate inequality. So I actually see the 21st century liberalism as being a sort of a vibrant project, but it might actually take on some qualitative differences compared to what was seen in the 20th century, which was largely a sort of formal political project. We might actually see a diversification, of liberal activity, and of course, all of that sort of predicted or envisaged modes of liberal activism must be complemented by continuing academic involvement by liberal thinkers. It is very much the case that liberal thinkers provide, in a leading or a forward manner, many of the sort of ideas that get adopted and embraced in actually existing societies, albeit with the lag. So there's still a very important role for scholarship in liberalism during the 21st century. So I think there's really much to do to advance freedom in our everyday lives, and it will be really exciting to see how liberalism advances onward and upward during the remainder of our lives and for those who follow us.
Oh, that's beautiful. You have so much to share, Mikayla. I feel like we have so much to learn from you. Just thank you so much for being here today. It was just fantastic. Thank you.
It's an honor and a privilege to always talk to you. Thank you, Jayme.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.